Hey guys, welcome back to Trekyards. I'm Captain Foley,
I'm Connor Cockins. Hi guys.
and today we've got a special in store for you because you guys enjoyed the look at the Klingon fleet and the evolution of Klingon designs so much. We thought we'd bring you another one, and this one's all about pre-Warp 5 flight technology or ship design, as you will. So, Samuel, talk to us a little about what you've done for us today.
So, Star Trek Enterprise was maybe not everyone's favourite show, but boy, did they have a lot of ships and a lot of iterative steps that really broaden the horizon. There's a ship called Horizon, that wasn't actually a joke, but maybe it is. Horizon of Federation, or at least Starfleet spaceships. And because they were actually designed out of order, or out of sequence, the X1 was designed sort of first, and everything else, or the Phoenix was, it was designed in this muddled order, so you never really think of it as this cohesive start to finish. And so I've gone ahead and I've gone into the scene files. I've brought these ships out. Some you've only seen once. Most of them you've only seen once, and some fun extras here. Put them in time order to when they appeared, and a couple of questions that arises from doing this research. And so hopefully we'll see and show you the evolution of technology, even if it's not the Warp 5 NX-01 style, because that was a very revolutionary step. But we'll see the evolution of technology of Earth as in Enterprise. Are you ready, Stuart?
I'm always ready, man. Let's go.
So this first ship, do you remember it from Enterprise?
Every episode, yes. And apparently, Linda Park is the person that is captaining that ship because her name's always beside it. I don't know. This is the X-33. It's actually also known as the Venture Star,
Hmm.
which is just a space plane.
Yeah, in the actual show files, it's called the X-33 as a nod to the actual X-33 that was designed and then cancelled. It's very close in design. I wanted to start here because this is the first future ship we see, and it was like you say, it was in the title sequence of every single episode. And I estimate it is around 2020 because it has to be after the International Space Station, but since we're on a different parallel timeline to their Trek, but it would still be after us. So this is still the future. This is the very first future ship in Enterprise. And I wanted to just put it in there because it was a fun one, I believe, designed by John Eaves. I think we just talked to him about this sort of stuff.
Yeah,
And you've only ever seen it in one angle, so here it is in all its glory. Their first pre-Warp 5 ship in the evolution of our tech.
yeah, it's pretty cool. As far as space plane, it was like a manned, reusable one, so it didn't
Mm.
require boosters to launch it. It just launched and landed as is.
Yeah.
Um, and a little side note, it was actually manufactured by Lockheed Martin, just so you know. Um, but its purpose, I always thought it was for like civilian trips up into space. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. I think it was more to replace the shuttle.
Mm-hmm.
So it was going up to the space station, taking up cargo,
Yeah.
things like that. So
But it's just a nice way that Trek was able to iterate on our present, even if our present didn't have these sorts of ships.
yeah. So this next one, this is one you guys might recognize. I don't know. It's a rather important one in human history, Star
Kinda.
Trek human history.
Kinda.
The first Warp 1 ship,
Mm-hmm.
well, Warp ship, designed by Zefram Cochrane. Now, this was in 2063 that this was launched. So this also was designed by John Eaves, and it's a pretty interesting little history on
Mm-hmm.
this ship.
Mm-hmm. And what's great is that obviously this last ship was just the Easter egg sort of bonus one. This is really the start of our journey. Warp 1 to get into Warp 5, and this was designed for First Contact. So this was before the Enterprise show was even a thing. So then they had to retroactively base some of the future designs off this prequel design, which they designed while in the TNG mindset, because they're making a TNG movie. Again, very interesting, but this was the first iteration step designed, at least you think that is. So what do you think about the warp engines, the warp themselves, as the very first warp human iteration?
I always liked seeing this thing on screen because of
Mm.
those nacelles. They did a nice tie-in with TOS, which I really
Mm.
appreciated as a TOS fan. Um, it's an interesting design, like I said, and we've done an episode on this.
Yep.
There's another one we have coming up eventually with John Eaves talking about it in a little bit more detail.
Yeah.
But the fact that they used existing technology by using the missile and converting a missile into this future, well, not this next step in human spaceflight, and ushering in a new era. Even though that was never really his intention. His intention was money. I think it's an irony that it's just an awesome addition to the Star Trek history. It is different than the original
For
warp.
sure.
Yeah, like the Starflight chronology. Sorry, done by Rick Sternbach years ago. So I had a little bit of an issue with that. I thought they could have tied that in a little bit more, but at the same time, this is a fantastic and very cool design, and I think it's something that's very practical and actually is something that could possibly come about. So
It's kind of the most hyper-real Star Trek ship. It is a rocket given engines. That's it. It's taken on real technology. And it's worth saying this is the Eagle Moss model. This was taken from Fabio's website, Meshweaver, because he did the amazing redo model, the very first proper CG model of this. I always did feel that the engines, they looked very similar to TOS, yet the iterative step, there's so many in between. I didn't think maybe they even needed the Bassards because they're going straight home. Why would they need to pull in this gas? They probably didn't need that, especially considering the cage has no glowing Bassards. So they also want to link into the TNG tech, which is what they were going for. But they're almost too advanced, and yet all you're really looking at is two glowing elements. One is just like a sheet of, plastic covering a coil, which is fine, that glows, and the Bassard is just a whatever. But I maybe too advanced, but it's interesting this became the jumping off point, and it set the precedent that ships should have glowing Bassards and such.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's what John Hughes does so well. He likes to tie in TOS and things and, make things cohesive.
Yeah. But
that being said, I do have a slight problem with this design. The fact that it's a little bit too complicated, let's say. To have those nacelles fold out, I just think it's a lot of extra mechanism that might not necessarily be incorporated into a design like this. I think it'd probably make more sense and be more realistic to have the warp nacelles like strapped to the hull somehow, instead of being encased in the rocket and then folding out. It just seems overly complicated.
I sort of agree, but you got to consider that there's that equation that I'm sure Zephyrin had. If the ship was launching as we see, then these extra pieces are having the air resistance, which is, taking more thrust to go against gravity, is less aerodynamic. And therefore have to put more physical chemical fuel on, and that creates a cause and effect. More fuel means more weight, which means more thrust, needing more fuel. Whereas adding these mechanical pieces and putting it into the hull, it's a risk it might not work. But what if it needs 10% less fuel, and that gets them into orbit, considering how I'm sure expensive fuel was. So
well, my thinking is because it was an ICBM ballistic missile. It was actually in a silo, so. It was already there, so you needed to construct these so that it could actually launch out of its silo. Now, that being said, all of these spaceships throughout history have always had test models and things done, and done test flights and things. So I'm wondering what kind of testing phase this went through, because really, how are you going to test it? I mean, I think the first test was the test.
That's interesting.
But that seems rather dangerous to me.
But a man who's drunk the whole time, he's like, we'll just try it.
I know it'll work.
Yeah, I mean,
People
come on,
from
Third
the
World
future
War.
told me.
But anyway, Stuart, now there's one interesting part of the Trek history that having, access to these studio assets, the next step, I think people always forget about, other shows like Voyager and DS9 and TNG and TOS, they throw in other dates, other times, other ships. The next one is one of those such things. So the next ship was launched in 2067, and it's Friendship 1. Now, this was introduced in Voyager as a exploration probe that actually went to was meant to go to another star system and be friends. Unfortunately, it was lost in the Delta Quadrant. I can't remember how, but it crashed on a planet and caused nuclear winter, and then they hated us forever. But this was launched 5 years later, and that is the canonical thing. So this is the next step of technology. Now, while the front bit certainly doesn't speak to a rustic style, the warp nacelles are what I want to look at, because this is meant to be 5 years later. It's going to still be warp 1. We haven't crossed that warp barrier, but this is from the initial production test version to workable, let's send out a probe nacelles. Did you remember this ship, Stuart? And what do you think about how it actually fits into the pre-warp history?
Yes, I did remember it, and it was launched by the United Earth Space Probe Agency, which was early Starfleet Command. Uh, I think it fits in perfectly. It does have the fixed nacelles, like I just kind of suggested for the Phoenix, which is an interesting choice. I think they might have realized it was overcomplicated to do that as well. But to put on a more of a modern day kind of satellite on the front, and just basically include the warp boost, like the warp nacelles to. I think it's a fantastic design. It makes a whole lot of sense. It's got antenna arrays facing back to send information. It's perfectly designed, and again, this is something that I can see us developing because it's based on tech that we have today, and it's a nice iterative step towards getting a ship out into the unknown.
Now, this was designed, 5, 6, 7 years before, or at least 3 or 4 before the Phoenix. They chose to make the warp nacelles. They still have that aft sort of coned element, which is very TOS familiar, but you've got these enclosed basards, and you've got no warp grills. So what do you think is the reason for this iterative step then? 5 years, different mission profile clearly, but why is it now lost those recognizable elements?
Because it's on a long-term space voyage with no humans on board. But I mean, I think to get rid of the grilling and such, because it was on such an extended mission, there was no humans on board, let's say, to maintain it. So you want to shield all those technical components. If something happened to them, at least they have shielding to kind of protect the inner workings. And I think that might be why they went with the more beefed up nacelles. Even the Bizarre collectors look like they're covered with something. So I think it was just additional shielding and, just something to keep it safe.
Yeah, it kind of does make sense. The next iterative step is now you've got the bare bones, encase it in a shield, because that's what you need for, like I say, long flight. Any micrometeor, if it'll smash right into the glass, transparent steel of a of a Bassard, although it's not going to be operational, so give it that extra bit of plating. But yeah, it's interesting.
So the next one is the SS Conestoga, launched in 2069. This one is one we've taken a look at in one of our episodes, and it's a fantastic little ship. The amount of detail they put in this model for what we see of it on screen, which is nothing, is amazing. And it's one of, as I've said before, it's one of my favorite designs as far as early ships go. I think it's fantastic.
But it's only 2 years after, which is then in itself only 3 to 9, which is 6 years. Only 6 years after the Phoenix. That's not a huge jump. Although any government that still existed would be like, right, we're going to test warp technology. We're really going to use it. This is our way to get off this hellhole of a planet. But then they start rebuilding, so it's fine. But it's certainly quite a lot different. I mean, if you go back to Friendship 1 again, look at the engines. Back to Conestoga, this is far more representative of the NX-01 style. This indicates to me, and obviously we're not taking into account the fact this was designed after and to look like the NX. That's not the point of this. It's just special. It's to look at it in the order, try and find those creative ties. My interpretation from this is that it's still a long-range mission, like I said for the last one, but manned, designed to land. Different priorities. You need maybe a lighter ship to get into orbit because it needs to have those initial jet propulsion. It needs to, whatever. You need to have the metal. It was already expensive enough, so to have the armor is less needed. Maybe refine the process. I mean, the Bassards are clearly slightly concealed. There's a lot less of a grilling. It's obviously a lot bigger. And I think we said in the initial episode talking about her that she was very much like, a cargo tanker with sort of stuff attached. It's very sort of rough, but also neat. So it kind of feels like they just took this shape, built a ship, and stuck warp nacelles onto it. But that's why it works, I think. So it's an interesting iterative step because it's just the warp nacelle technology has improved. And we can see, I think there's a nice little jump there.
Yeah, and another cool thing that ties this in with earlier spaceflight technology is the chemical engines. But yeah, as you said, this was meant to land. It's actually the hull and all the materials on board were actually there specifically so when they reached their destination they could use them to construct a colony. So this ship was designed to be taken apart. So I'm sure there's nothing that's not needed, because you do want to keep it light You don't want to have a lot of armor or shielding. You're not sure what you're going to run into, I guess, but you should have some. But at the same time, it has to be easily salvageable and something that can be used to incorporate into a colony in the future. So I think that kind of thinking is incredible. I personally wouldn't want to be on a ship that's not going back to Earth, but that's just me. I don't know. It depends how screwed up Earth is, I guess.
Well, that's the question. I mean, what do you think about the timeline? 6 years, and we saw the state Earth was in the Phoenix launch. Within 6 years, they were already to the point of having enough money, having enough manpower to build a ship to colonize another planet. 6 years. What do you think about that?
It seems a little sketchy to me, to be perfectly honest. What was the top speed of this thing? Like warp 2?
Oh, I think we're still at warp 1 at this point.
Warp 1, okay.
Maybe warp 1.5, but we're not at the 2 barrier yet.
Yeah, okay. Well, that makes sense then. I know that the Vulcans were there and they weren't helping us, so they weren't.
That's interesting.
They weren't adding to this tech really. But once you develop a technology, like look at smartphones. Once the first smartphone came out, within 6 years, you were already up to like some massive improvements. And I'm sure warp technology, it would just, once you have the initial principle, all you have to do is refine it.
Yeah.
Focus the energy a little bit better, harness a little bit, things like that. Definitely safety protocols. So I think that speaks to the engines looking the way they do. Again, more shielded, because this was, again, a longer mission as well. But you did have humans there to maintain it, so you could still have elements that were showing.
You can still push the boundaries a bit. They're probably pushing 1.2, 1.3,
Yeah. So I think 6 years is probably fine for this design, as long as they're not going warp 4 all of a sudden. Then I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah.
So
it's certainly an interesting. We haven't cracked impulse yet. 6 years, we still haven't got that technology, but this must have been one or two of a kind. I mean, I can't see us being this must have been like we're putting our resources to get to another planet, make that situation, make that, because it's also we have to push other technology to get to this point. Maybe they're pushing communication technology, they're pushing all these other things as part of the package to get this ship ready. So that might have been the excuse as well.
Yeah, it kind of makes the Vulcans look like a bunch of assholes, though. I mean, that's like having a guest come over to your house who owns a minivan, and you have to go to a town that's like 300 kilometers away, but all you have is a bicycle.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And they're like, oh, well, just goodbye.
We'll see you then.
We're not going to give you a ride.
Oh, can you imagine the Vulcan's like, well, safe trip, and he says, right, in 2 years we'll go meet them. It'll take us 3.5 hours to meet them.
Yeah, exactly.
See
How you guys doing?
We left Earth. Do you want to take any messages back? Because we go back in about 3 hours.
Yeah. We can bring you supplies and stuff, if you really want.
But the next iterative step is an interesting one. This is the Emmet. Now, this is also a ship you've seen in every single episode. This is if you remember from the title sequence, it's a ship flying over the moon. This is the proto-warp delta. This is the original ship concept they designed for that title sequence, which was then retro-engineered into the warp delta. So you've never seen it from this side in the show. So this is what it looks like. And one thing you can tell from this ship is that it still has a chemical engine propulsion. Now, there is no date given on this, but given its other technology, I guesstimated maybe 2100s. So a decent leap, because we are starting to get into the technology looking like, the future. This is probably their first style of craft like this, and which actually sets a precedent that this more triangle design was the first Federation, starship. Everyone bitches about Discovery, but there's again those two shapes, the saucer and the point. I mean, these things came first. The first saucer in Prime was the NX-01, so this is the first of the style.
And this thing ties back into the X-33 with the shape.
Absolutely.
The X-33 has this kind of delta shape. So I mean, I don't know why people complain so much about that. I mean, like you said, the NX-01 is the first full saucer shape. So,
what do you think of this design and of its evolution?
Very plain from this view. I gotta say, there's no windows, there's no visible bridge.
Again, you were not meant to see this model.
Yes.
This was not built for
So
detail.
maybe it is missing details. Who knows?
Well, I just never designed it.
I think it's a great step. Like I said, designing from the X-33 days up to this, I think makes perfect sense. Looks very Romulan, though. TOS Romulan. But yeah, I think this was more of a shuttle as far as shuttling people to and from the moon, to Mars, kind of within the solar system kind of thing. Get to Mars in like a few minutes.
That's interesting.
At just over warp, you know. And we do see it going to the moon, so I'm sure that's what it was. It was helping colonize the moon and Mars and setting up that kind of future expansion. Because we know that in Enterprise, they are starting to terraform Mars by that point, by deflecting comets to crash into the poles and get the water in the atmosphere and stuff. So I think this would be used in solar system to kind of start expanding. And being able to actually carry a substantial amount of people per trip.
This and we'll see the scale at the end, so we'll know if that fits people wise. But this feels like the ship of the line to me. It's a very simplified hull. Nothing is there that doesn't need to be there. You know, it's got the shape, like I say, of the precursor X-33. So it's obviously this feels like this is we're going to build a small fleet of these. We'll commission them. Nothing not needed. We've got new warp nacelles, which are actually both. They finally have the Bassards, like, for me, that feel justified. Like, we need to make sure we keep refueling, but yet they have the armor to not need the outer grills. You know, so there's that interesting step. Like, we have this mission profile. Chemical engines are interesting, and if you look, they still have those two an X-01 styled superchargers, which is an interesting. So I guess they started 100 years earlier. But this, even though it's so simple, it feels like the ship of the line. Because look at Navy ships. I mean, look at really nice sleek ones. There's they are simpler. They are obviously you've got the hull detail, but the shapes of the main hull are simple. This feels like we've now got a spaceship. This is now our Starfleet. But you're right. I think it's still designed to keep in system, but can go. Maybe this is the first ship that went to Vulcan. Took a little while, but did go to Vulcan. Because I'm sure we're hitting into the warp. Warp 2. That's why I would say this is the first Warp 2 ship. That'd be my personal guess. Maybe the superchargers will go to Warp 2. Maybe.
That's interesting, yeah. Well, speaking of Warp 2, the next class of ship launched in about 2101, which was the J-class freighters. This one specifically is the ECS Horizon, but these were Warp 2. Just a little above Warp 2. I think Warp 2.4-ish. They could push them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a Warp 2 engine, but obviously you can overclock.
Yeah. And as you can see by the engine design, it is an upgraded engine from what we've seen prior. So
actually very similar, though, when you look at it. Actually, surprisingly similar.
It is, yeah. Looks a little bit shorter and a little bit bulked out at the front. But we know for a fact this thing can go Warp 2.
Now, there's an interesting question. We see two transport ships in the show. Both are meant to be old, or meant to be rustic. But this one has a solid date of 2101 as its initial launch. I researched that quite heavily. Now, the problem is, and we'll go to the next ship. This is the Y class. This was Mayweather's ship, I believe it fought the Nausicaans or one or the other. Now, this was a Warp 1.8 ship. This was not a Warp 2 ship, yet it's a Class Y. And if you know the alphabet, Y comes after J.
What?
And it looks more advanced. Yet it's a Warp 1.8. And we know that the last ship was a Warp 2 because they said they're still using their stock engine. This confuses me. That's why I guesstimated that this is 2104, even though we see it in 2151, but we know that a lot of information had to correlate. So it's seen in 2151, right? And we know it's only Warp 1.8. They say we can give you Warp 3 engine, but they say Warp 1.8. And the captain says, it's been 3 generations of people that have lived on this ship. 3 generations of my family. Now, a generation tends to be 25 years. Can be smaller, can be larger. That's the default. Now, obviously, if the initial person came on at, say, 30, brought his kid, that would skip a generation, but still 3 generations. But you're still looking at 50 plus years, which would make it older than the J-class, which would make sense, because the J-class is Warp 2, But then why was the Y class designed before the J class?
It's interesting. Interesting question, but I mean, looking at these warp engines, they're clearly a totally different design.
Yes, and also the hull. I mean, they are very different. I mean, which would you say looks more advanced?
Uh, I'd say the Y class. Well, it looks very
Yeah,
Cylon-esque from the front.
yes, I would say the Y class is interesting. The warp engines feel much more workhorse, but then the J class, the NXO, it has more of an NXO1 styling. So,
Yeah.
but the Y class can carry more cargo, and it's actually a lot bigger. If you go when we go to the scale chart at the end, the Y class is hugely larger than the J class. J
Well,
class is very very small in
the,
comparison.
well, the J class literally is that front module. It's like a tug, and you lock on all these cargo
Mm.
containers to the back of it. The Y class has the long center section, which you attach pods to. So it's a much longer ship.
It's not.
Um,
It's really not. If you
well,
skip to the
I
end,
mean,
personally.
it's not just the front little part, is what I'm saying.
Oh right, sure, okay, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
whereas
I suppose.
the other one clearly is. I mean, it's basically a tug or a pickup truck that you just lock cargo containers onto. And when
My
it doesn't have those, it's got a very small.
hmm, hmm. Well, my guesstimation behind this is that because, like I say, the J class is a much smaller vessel and it can carry a lot less cargo. My guess is that they were both designed around the same time but for different purposes. Like you build one class for the you know, because we know that the Y class is for like 6th month or more journeys. You know, and if it can carry that much more cargo, then maybe design the big. You know, if they're being designed at the same time, you can one was built first, but they were both designed around the same time. Maybe one had some problems, they pushed back, but one was designed to carry cargo all the way to Alpha Centauri, whereas the other one was designed to carry stuff to Mars and back and a bit further. So you have the bigger ship be older, but it was designed first, and but or it was wide linked to some other thing. I just find that was a strange thing because both had their default warp 1.8 for Y and 2 for J, and yet they look so different. But we know one was released 2101. It's a easy thing to fix if they change the numbers, but this is what happened. Any other gut thoughts on that, Stuart?
Mm, Not really, except that maybe the J class was a newer build, but they kind of. I mean, that happens in the military too. Sometimes they'll go and they'll number things differently when they start a new, or if it's a new construction contract from a different company, which could be the case in this because the warp engines are so different in design. It could literally be from a different contractor.
Yeah, so like they're both ECS. They're both the same branding. They're
Well,
both
Earth Cargo Ship is basically what that stands for.
yeah.
So, but still, it doesn't matter. You can. It's like having a Ford and a Chevy, but they're both owned by the military. They're
Mm,
both made by different companies, but they're both used by the same organization. So they'd both be labeled ECS. They would just be
mm,
have different design elements to them because they're
mm.
built in different factories.
Yeah, it's a weird one there. They look so different. I mean, so different, and yet they're so
Hmm.
around the same period. I just thought that was an interesting sidestep. Like this was our. I mean, we know this is the Warp 2, Warp 1.8 boundaries. This is the very first Warp 2 ship. It's probably the Horizon. So this is that step,
Mm.
and take it as you think. Yeah.
Well, the next one interests me a great deal.
Yes.
This is the little model starship that Jonathan Archer was flying around as
Yeah.
a kid. Now, we got a date on this is 2121.
Mhm.
Um, this to me looks like again, tying back to the X-33 and even the Emmet as the next kind of design influence. Whether it was actually built as a real ship or not, we'll never know. It could just be based on test models or computer simulations, things that they were testing for warp for the next advancement. Who knows? But I love that you included this.
And that was the real model used. So it's nice to give it another bit of extra,
Nice.
life. But do you want to hear my rationale for including it specifically?
Yes, of course.
Like you say, it's a model starship, and it was in 2121 was when Archer was playing with it as a kid. Now it's a two-person craft. We see that in the piece. And obviously, that could just be retroactively adding two people. But my interpretation on this is that you tend to make models of real ships, And if his father was leading the warp program, this is something that might happen. So my extrapolation on this this was based on a warp test ship, because if you look at the engines, they're very stylized. It's an interesting design. It very much follows the previous steps, but my thought is it's a warp 225 test ship, of a very certain style, or even the luxury yacht of the warp fleet. It's a warp 2, but it's only 2 people, so it's designed to get somewhere very fast. And so him playing with it is like playing with a famous ship of the past. So that was my thought when I included this, because it does fit so many of the old styles. I don't know why you would design other warp ships when you've got the warp legacy as the models. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I know that for a fact there are models based on X ships and concept ships from the military and stuff that they built 1 or 2 of to test, and it turned out they didn't approve the design, or for whatever reason, right? I think that's probably more what this is. I do love the tie-in with the TOS engines, though. I mean, they're very much just stubby versions of the TOS design engine. So yeah, it could be even on the drawing boards right now, or well, not now, but in Archer when he was a kid time period, and eventually it gets. This could be the next thing that they go back to after it's failed, kind of thing.
I just thought it was an interesting. You can take it either way. It was a ship that we saw, even as a model, and it must link to something, even if it's just conceptual. Yeah. But the next solid ship we have is the Warp Alpha, and then Delta, and all those jazz. Now this was a Warp 2.5 test ship and a Warp 3 test ship. So we've now finally hit Warp 3, and that's in 2143.
And that is it for this week's Trekyards. Wow.
Trekyards. Wow, is that like a new show?
It could be. If you like that idea, then do click into next week and see if it becomes a show name. It won't. But
anyway, the point is, tune in next week. You'll see the rest.
Part 2. Bye, guys.